Yes, tonight I'll be joined by my former news editor turned author, Nic Outterside. Nic is an award-winning newspaper editor who left journalism after 28 years in the industry, following a nervous breakdown. He has gone on to write his first book of poetry as part of his recovery, called The Hill, Songs and Poems of Darkness and Light. In it, he covers his issues such as childhood sexual abuse, cancer and bereavement. Hello, Nic. Could you tell me a little bit more about your book and how it came about?
Oh, crumbs. The book was a complete accident. I never envisaged myself as a poet. I scribbled some poetry down when I was a teenager, maybe, and certainly never ever saw myself as a published poet. It came about a year ago, just over a year ago, 15 months ago. I suffered what, for all intents and purposes, was a nervous breakdown. And part of the recovery process prescribed by my doctor was to start talking through and writing down, if possible, some of the issues which led to the breakdown. I began a blog, which can be still seen on www.seagullnick.wordpress.com, and started to chart the events of my life which led to that breakdown. When I got writer's block, or just the whim sort of attached itself to me, I started to write one or two things as poems. And gradually the poetry started to grow, and I think it must have been about this time last year. I had about 10,000 hits on the blog and about 100 followers, and all of the positive spin on my blog, the positive feedback, was all about my poems, which I found absolutely gobsmacking. And over a period of probably 2 or 3 months, coming through to about February of this year, people were sort of saying to me, some complete strangers, Nic, you ought to publish this as a book. And that thought had never crossed my mind. And anyway, here it is. The book was published last week, and 1,000 print run to start with, and it's selling well, and fingers crossed, but it's certainly part of the recovery.
Well done. Could you tell me a little bit more about the breakdown itself, how it showed itself?
Oh, my goodness. I'd had a lot of things befall me in my life, probably maybe more than average, and I'd sort of a little bit of counselling on the way, and attempted to deal with them as best I could. And I think at the end of the day, it was the string that broke, or the straw that broke the camel's back. And June the 16th last year, I was in the newsroom like any other day. A few things had happened to trigger the breakdown, and suddenly I found myself 8:30 in the morning, crying my eyes out, running for the door. I got home, and my poor wife found me sitting in an armchair in the living room staring at the wall. And that's about all I can remember of the actual day of the breakdown. But it was sudden and totally unexpected.
If I understand correctly, it partly stemmed from your childhood sexual abuse. Is that right?
I think it probably started, yes, it started and ended there. If you want me to go into a little bit of detail about the events which led up to the breakdown, I mean, I was sexually abused at the age of 14 into the age of 15 by a Scout district commissioner in the area where I lived in the south of England. It coloured my entire life. Everything which followed looked back on that. And I suffered numerous relationship breakdowns as a result of that. I questioned my own sexuality to start with. I couldn't form any bonds with anybody, least of all partners, and went through 2 divorces and a number of breakups with other people close to me. And it would have been about it was November 1990. I was talking to someone for the very, very first time about the abuse. So this is like 20 years after it happened. The abuse happened in 1970, 1971. And they gave me the courage to report it. And I was living in Scotland at the time, and I went along to my local police station and made a formal complaint. I said, look, this man did this to me, and I know to other boys as well. And they took it very seriously. And the inspector interviewed me and said, look, Nic, we'll look into this. We'll have to liaise with the police force in the area where it happened. And he said, we'll get back to you. And 2 weeks passed. At the time, I was editing a newspaper in the west of Scotland. And I had a phone call to go back into the police station. And the inspector sat me down and he said, I'm afraid it's some bad news. Your abuser is dead. He died a few years ago. And that's the information we have from the other police force. At the time, I know I took it very badly. I was very angry, I think. I was 24 years younger than I am now, and I was just livid. I thought, how can this man have escaped and done this to me, and I know to other boys? And he's just died. And I got on with life, and it didn't help what had happened. I still went through relationship and friendship breakdowns and all the anger that pursued me all of my life, and which resulted in things like alcoholism and so forth. And then a year and a half ago, I was working at my last newspaper. I've been editing there for 8 years and been dealing with a number of child sex abusers in our area, and was searching on genesreunited.com for some information about this particular sex abuser, which I found very quickly, and I was amazed at this website. And I thought, I wonder what I can find about my abuser's own death and his family. And I couldn't find anything initially. There's nothing in the 1980s about him at all in the area where I lived. And I widened my search a little bit, and bingo, I found he died in 1996, a whole 6 years after the police told me he was dead. That led to all sorts of thoughts. Was this a cover-up? Was it just a complete cock-up by the police? And that stewed on me for 2 or 3 weeks, and then a very minor thing happened in the newsroom, and that was the breakdown.
Hmm. I mean, can you tell us about the abuser now? Can you tell us about the situation?
He was a young middle-aged man. I was 14. He would have been about 40, I think, from memory, looking at the date of his death and how old he was then. He was the district commissioner for scouting in the area where I lived. I'd been in Scouts since I was 7 years old as a wolf cub. And he gathered a coterie of boys around him. I was one of them. And I finally managed to get out of it he'd called a patrol leaders meeting at his house in the town. And after about an hour of the meeting, I found myself and one other boy called Brian, with only 2 left. And I remember this day, both of us looking at each other, absolutely panic-stricken. We're in his house on our own this time. And we both just ran for the door, and we ran into the night. And my father eventually found me in his car. This was long before the days of mobile phones. I'd had to ring home. And I remember getting absolutely hammered by my parents for how dare I run away from this nice man's house, and how worried they were about me. But I never could tell them. And my dad died 6 years ago, and he died not knowing.
Why was it you couldn't tell anybody at the time?
Oh, all manner of things, mainly guilt. The guilt and the shame that I think lots of teenagers go through. Crikey, if this man has done this to me, I must be, in those days, we used the word a puff. I must be a puff. I must be gay, After all, I let him do it to me. And that then deepened, and once that was embedded in me, I couldn't break that. And I went away to university, and like a lot of boys at 18 years old, I tried to bed every girl I could find to prove to myself I was not queer. And I'm sorry, I'm using the language of the time. My mind was all over the place. And as I said to you a few minutes ago, it then impacted on every aspect of my life which followed.
And how did he put you in that situation? What was his, form of manipulation?
Initially shame. He caught me with other boys in our tent. I won't go into any sort of details of what 13, 14-year-olds do when they're on scout camp, but initially shame, and then what would happen if your parents knew, and then secret, and then you are part of this, and just imagine how horrifying. This is 1970. Relationships with parents were very different back then. My dad and I only became close when I was in my 30s or 40s. We did not have the same levels of communication that kids have with their parents these days, on the whole.
Based on your experience, would you have any advice for the current government inquiries?
Yeah, it needs to be totally transparent. They need to dig a lot deeper. I've seen some of the stuff that's come out this week regarding the fact that these so-called files into child sexual abuse in the 70s and 80s have gone missing. I don't believe that for one instance. As a journalist, I was given certain names of former cabinet ministers 24 years ago, and I've kept those names in my head, and those names are only just starting to come out now. I think that it needs to be total transparency. Whether we'll get it, I really genuinely don't know. But there are a lot of people in very senior positions in this country, in the establishment, the judiciary, the police, the government. Forget about the so-called pop stars and DJs. That's just the froth on the surface. It's a lot more, I believe, as a journalist and as an abuse victim, a lot more sinister than that.
Who do you think should be running the inquiry?
We need to find somebody totally independent of the establishment, but somebody who's also respected. I mean, Michael Mansfield's name has been suggested. Somebody like him, who is seen as independent from all sides, although I'm sure the Conservative government would not necessarily see him as that. Somebody who is devoid of any former inquiries. I lived for 8 years in North Wales, and there was an ongoing inquiry there into the abuse which happened in children's homes in North Wales.
Okay. Do you think there has been improvements, though? That there is more transparency?
I think only by default. I don't think the government of any shade has gone out and sought to improve things. I think it's only been by public pressure and the likes of abuse victims and one or two very, very good MPs who have actually stood up and raised the questions in the House of Commons that we're actually getting anywhere now. I mean, my abuse was 44 years ago, but you look at the Jimmy Savile cases, they go back to the 50s and 60s. This has been going on for one hell of a long time, and there have been some very, very powerful people, including former prime ministers, who knew and then did nothing. There's a wonderful interview, it's available on the internet, of a former Tory chief whip who talked about it openly in an interview with the BBC back in the 1990s. No, it stinks.
As a newspaper editor, if you knew the names at the time, were you unable to print them? Why weren't they printed?
Unable to print them for lack of burden of proof. I've a number of friends who are unfortunately a number of friends who are former and late MPs. I mean, two I can name. One is Margaret Ewing, the former SNP MP, and the other is Bill Hodgson, a Tory MP. And both of them talked about this. I mean, Bill particularly, and Bill named names. He went beyond, this is going back to 1990, he went beyond the names of Harvey Proctor, who had been convicted of certain crimes, and said, look, these other people are involved along with him. And one of them at the time was a cabinet minister. And that cabinet minister in the early 90s suddenly was no longer a cabinet minister because the pressure was being put to bear.
Do you think these people will ever be brought to justice?
I think a little bit like Nazi war criminals. I think time's running out on a lot of them. A lot of them are into their 80s and that now. Whether they will end up like my abuser did, dying before they're brought to justice, I genuinely don't know. I hope so. Just not for anybody else, but for the victims.
And for yourself, you've made it public, you've written about it. How has this helped you?
Oh, I've called him in the last year my demon. It's enabled me to exercise that demon. Some of it is in the poetry, in the book. A lot of it is written at great length on my blog. And I've talked about him and what he did, but also about how it impacts on people's lives. One of the things that makes me a little bit angry now, I hear people try and deflect away from some of these court cases. Oh, it happened a long time ago. Why should we be bringing these old men to justice now? What they don't seem to realise is the paradox, which is the longer it goes on, the greater the harm to the victims. It literally ruins complete lives. Okay,
and can you tell us how people can order your book?
Well, sure. Probably the quickest and easiest way is to go onto my website, which is www.writeahead, that's all one word, writeahead.co.uk. That's writeahead.co.uk, and they'll see a section on the website where it gives details of how to order the book.
Nick, could you please share your blog address as well?
The blog, yes, certainly. www.seagullnic, that's SEAGULLNIC.wordpress.com.
Okay, thank you, Nick.
Thank you much indeed, Angela.
You're listening to dialectradio.co.uk.